Austan Goolsbee, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, great to see you again.
So I haven't had anyone talking about the global economy in a few months, and it does seem high time. I guess one way I want to get into this is that there's so much that feels unprecedented in these times. I mean, this extraordinary sudden contraction because we had to shut everything down with COVID, and then this extraordinary explosion of demand because we opened up again. What percentage of what we're experiencing right now just can be explained simply by those two facts?
Those are both great facts. And I'm tempted to just say a third, a third, and another third. I think it's an unprecedentedly steep downturn and an unprecedentedly rapid comeback. But another thing to graft on it is it looked nothing like a normal recession. So normal recessions are driven by cyclically sensitive parts of the economy, like durable goods manufacturing and housing and TVs and stuff like that. And normally the things that don't go down in recessions in rich countries are services. And this one looked nothing like a recession. All of the stuff that normally goes down went up. In the United States, in Europe, in the high-income countries, they bought more TVs. They wanted to buy more housing. They want to buy more cars, leading to an overloading of the supply chain for physical goods. And the thing that led the downturn was a bunch of people not going to the dentist and stuff that's normally recession-proof. And so I think, I'll say at least 2/3 of what we've observed it was about the nature of what was happening.
Now, a lot of people were very critical of the policy response the last time we had a massive recession, 2008, 2009, in part because they said we were taking care of the rich people and we didn't really care about the average American. No one can say that about this crisis, right?
Ian, I was there for the stimulus in 2009. And the critique of the policy in 2009 in dealing with the financial crisis, of course, was they wished it were bigger. And coming out of the Bush administration, people wished it wasn't primarily geared toward financial institutions. So you could almost feel that in the response of the CARES Act under Trump and the rescue plan under Biden, that they weren't going to make the mistake of it being too small. They make it as big as it could possibly be, and they'll spread it around so it doesn't just go to banks. They're going to be checks to people. We're going to help the unemployed. We're going to help the airline industry, the cruise ship industry. We're going to help all small business. We're going to have the Fed engage and unlock massive amounts of lending. Looking back, for sure, given that the recovery was as fast as it was, you would not do as big of a rescue amounts as we did we did $5 trillion in the CARES Act and another $2 trillion in the rescue plan. Not to mention there were some others as they go along. And that's the biggest spend that we've ever had, bigger than all the wars except World War II combined. So I think the magnitude you would probably do smaller.
Now, why do you think today, with unemployment as low as it is, I mean, I understand that inflation upsets people, but is that solely the reason why people seem so incredibly negative about their economic estimates going forward, no matter who you talk to?
Look, the thing is, the polling data, there's one gap in the polling data that's bigger than we've ever seen before, which is if you ask people, how is the economy, they say awful, like as bad as they've ever said the economy was, even worse than during the Great Recession. And yet, if you ask them individually, how is your situation? How is your bank account? They're saying it's pretty good. And that's because, as you highlighted, the unemployment rate is extremely low. They're upset that wages for a lot of people have not kept up with inflation. But overall, the difference between how they say the economy's doing and how they say their personal finances are doing has never been bigger. So then we got to try to figure out why is that. I think part of it is that real incomes have slipped because for a lot of people, wages did not go up as much as prices. But even there, it's not really sufficient because if you look at 2021, that was a year in which prices for the average family went up about $2,000, $2,500 more than their wages went up. And the average family got a $3,500 tax cut as part of the rescue plan. So if you look at the actual income situation of the average family, it was dramatically in the black. It was not in the red. So I don't think that the reality can really explain all of why the polling is as negative as it is.
What do you think is going to be sticky in terms of changes in how we think about the global economy on the back of the pandemic?
My view is if something was a trend for 50 or 100 years before COVID, and we see a dramatic reversal for 2 years in an extremely unusual period, I think it's overwhelmingly likely we're going to go back to what it was before because there were some important factors driving it that. We should be making all of this lower end stuff at home. In the case of an emergency like this, you want to be able to have your own masks and have your own vaccines and have your own baby formula, have your own socks, whatever it is. I think that will end up being a blip, even though that's now an overwhelming trend. I think the fact that forgets how we got to the lean production system and globalized supply chain we had before COVID. And that is, they're big economies of scale and it's cheaper. And as I say, what's going to happen is 2 years, 4 years, sometime from now, somebody's going to wake up and they're going to look out the window and they're going to say, why do we have a giant warehouse full of socks that we made here that we could buy on the open market for 1/3 the price and we can just have shipped here when we need them? Why do we have this warehouse? And at that moment, kind of the legacy of the pandemic will be forgotten.
Speaking of blips, I mean, for decades before the pandemic, labor had less and less influence with capital and in the political system. That obviously is changing now. And everybody wants to work more flexibly. People don't want to be in the office. They can demand a lot more. Is that also a blip?
I kind of am afraid that a lot of that is a blip, that right now workers have almost unprecedented level of bargaining power where, as one CEO described it, the only question is, do you want your popcorn buttered or salted? So the thing that I think we're going to have to see is if you look in the period from, let's say, 1970 to 2020, over that 50-year period, we had a lot of productivity growth and pay did not match it. So the theory says that people's pay should track productivity. But we had a lot of productivity growth and that split from wages. And that's a different way of saying corporate profits as a share of national income rose to unprecedented levels as a kind of a frontline indicator of what's the power, the bargaining power of workers. And right now, workers are demanding and receiving work from home, flexibility, things like that. But now roll the tape forward to a period where it's more like a normal labor market. Forget about a recession-like labor market. Let's say we're just in normal times. I think the employers are going to, it's going to be the empire is going to strike back. And the employers are basically going to say, either, no, we demand you come to work. And if you don't want to come into the office, go work somewhere else. Or they're going to say, hey, you've gotten a nice bounty being able to work from home. So we're going to pay you less, or we're going to expect you to work more on your own time. So all of those things make me think it's not going to be as rosy a scenario as it seems right now.
Okay. So, Austin, let's get to inflation for a moment. How troubled are you by the persistence of this inflation, clearly longer and louder than the Biden administration had expected? Do you think it is with us for the foreseeable future, and what are the implications of it?
It's been longer and louder. I will highlight, it's not just government officials who have made the mistake of thinking inflation was going to go away or be smaller. The market absolutely made the same mistake. Just look at interest rates. They set interest rates below what the inflation rate ended up being. So the real interest rate was negative. If you borrowed money, if you got a mortgage at the rates before, you've been doing great for this year. I have thought that the answer to the question of what we need to do hinges critically on this second question of, did the inflation come from supply or did it come from demand? If it came from excess stimulus, excess monetary stimulus, excess fiscal stimulus, which there are a lot of economists think it did, then the correct answer is the Fed needs to tighten monetary policy and raise the interest rate and try to cool off demand. And that's kind of the traditional Fed thing to do. They really only have one tool, which is the screwdriver. We can tighten it, we can loosen it. And they look at the interest rate sensitive parts of the economy, and that's what they do. The problem is, if the inflation came from supply, if you think war in Ukraine or the labor supply shocks from COVID or a series of things hitting the supply chain are where the inflation came from, well, there's another lesson from the 1970s, which is supply shock inflation doesn't go away from just tightening demand. And that what the Fed would do in that case, they could raise the unemployment rate, but they're just going to generate a stagflation. So that's the religious schism, as I call it, within the economics community over where did the inflation come from? And that is why I think the Fed has been slow to act, is they've been sitting and waiting, hoping to figure out, well, was it supply and is it going to go away on its own, or is it demand and we're going to have to crank this thing down? I think
and it sounds like you're saying it is mostly supply.
I thought from the beginning it was mostly supply. I will say that in the last 2 months, the fact that the non-energy, non-food parts of inflation, the so-called core inflation, which the Fed looks at as the pointer for what's the true state of affairs, the fact that that has not been coming down has led me to revise my view of how much of this was supply. And I think if we get a couple, even 2 more months like the ones we just saw, I think they're going to be consulting the ghost of Paul Volcker, and the Fed is really going to.
And then rates are going way
they need
up.
to raise rates a lot.
So I have to ask you the one question. Larry Summers says we have to, let go a whole bunch of people if you want to fix this inflation story. I take it you do not actually agree with that.
I don't. It kind of goes to my thing of you got to answer, how much of this inflation do you think came from demand or supply? In Larry's mind, I think is the view that this inflation is overwhelmingly from too much demand. And so in that world, he says, we got to raise the unemployment rate to 10% for 1 year or 7.5% for 3 years. Or he gave you a whole menu schedule of what you could choose. Fundamentally, that's a story of demand. And I think at least 50% of the inflation is not from demand. So what could easily happen if you were going to follow that prescription is you could raise the unemployment rate to 7.5%. Millions of people lose their job, and then the inflation's not going away because it's not coming from excess demand. In which case, you probably want to be a little circumspect. I mean, what it means for the unemployment rate to go to 7.5% is a lot of pain for millions of people.
So the next couple of months are actually pretty critical in this entire equation.
I think that's true. I think the next couple of months, how fast the Fed and other central banks raise rates, and whether you start to see the core inflation begin to come down and make people feel a little like the heat is a little less on them. It's not going to remove the political heat because it's not on an election timetable. So it's not going to be solved by November. But if the new months of inflation started coming in lower because we started to get relief on the supply chain, I think that would be one path. If not, if it just kept accelerating, even the new months keep accelerating, then I think the Fed and the central banks are going to have no choice but to raise rates quite a lot more.
Austan Goolsbee, thanks for joining us today.
Great to see you.